Life with Jessica had always been a bit of a roller coaster, but lately, it felt more like a free fall. Ever since we got married, I knew she liked the finer things in life: designer handbags, luxurious vacations, but I thought we had an understanding. We'd work our way up, build something together. My business was still in its early stages, and while it had potential, the profits were unpredictable. One month we'd be flush, the next, we'd be scraping by to cover basic expenses. But Jessica didn't see it that way. Her demands were starting to come fast and furious. "Marcus, I'm not asking for the moon," she said one morning, her voice full of exasperation as she scrolled through her phone. "Just a simple handbag. Everyone at the gym has one of these new collections." It's embarrassing. I glanced up from my laptop, trying to stay calm. "We need to be careful with money right now, Jess. You know the business is still finding its feet. We've got to prioritize," she scoffed, setting her phone down a little too hard. "Prioritize? Marcus, we're not living in the 1900s. You expect me to walk around like a peasant while all my friends are dressed like queens?" I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to center myself. This conversation was becoming all too familiar. Jessica never worked, never needed to, according to her, but her demands were growing heavier by the day. I could feel the weight of them, piling on top of everything else I was trying to juggle. Liam, our 8-year-old son, sat across from us at the kitchen table, finishing up his cereal. Football practice was in an hour, and as usual, Jessica would be the one to take him. She'd become oddly enthusiastic about his practices lately, going out of her way to never miss a session. I didn't question it at first. After all, it was great to see her taking such an active role in his life. But as time went on, it felt like there was more to it. "All right, Marcus, fine. If you won't buy it, I'll figure something out," Jessica huffed, standing up and grabbing her keys. "I'll take Liam to practice. Maybe I'll go shopping afterward, who knows?" I watched her leave, biting my tongue. There was no point in arguing. Every conversation seemed to lead us back to the same place: her wanting more than I could give, and me feeling like I was constantly failing her. The business had its ups and downs. A few months ago, we had a great run: new clients, steady cash flow, even a potential partnership with a larger firm. But just as quickly as things had improved, they started to dip again. Contracts were slow to close, expenses were piling up, and my stress levels were through the roof. Liam, blissfully unaware of the tension between Jessica and me, skipped over to me with his football gear slung over his shoulder. "Dad, are you coming to the game on Saturday?" "I wouldn't miss it, buddy," I smiled, ruffling his hair. "I'll be there, front and center." As they left for practice, I sat back down, trying to focus on the emails flooding my inbox. But my mind kept drifting back to Jessica. She wasn't the woman I married. Or maybe she was, and I had just been blind to it all these years. Weeks passed, and her demands became more frequent. It wasn't just handbags anymore. She wanted new jewelry, high-end dinners, trips to exotic locations. It was like she was trying to fill some void, and no matter how much we spent, it wasn't enough. One evening, she came back from taking Liam to football practice, practically glowing. "I've got great news," she exclaimed, bursting into the living room where I was catching up on some work. "What's that?" I asked, glancing up from my laptop, trying to match her enthusiasm. "I found a way to make some extra money. You don't have to worry about buying me those things anymore," she smiled, though something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. "Really? What's the plan?" "I've started doing makeup and pedicures for some of the moms at football practice. They're paying me really well. I can go to their houses, it's flexible, and it's fun. Win-win, right?" She said it so casually, so convincingly, that I almost believed her. But deep down, something didn't feel right. Jessica had never shown any interest in working, and suddenly she was excited about offering beauty services. That's great, Jess. I'm proud of you," I replied, trying to sound supportive. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. Was I being paranoid? Or was there something more to this job of hers? As time went on, I started noticing small changes in her routine. She was leaving the house more often, spending longer hours out, and coming back with new clothes and accessories that didn't quite match the earnings of a part-time beauty gig. Her phone, once left casual ly on the kitchen counter, was now always in her hand or tucked away in her purse. She smiled more, laughed at jokes I wasn't in on, and seemed happy, happier than she had been in a long time. But not with me. One afternoon, when I got home early from a meeting, I found her in the living room, texting someone with a smirk on her face. The moment she saw me, her expression shifted. She quickly put the phone away and asked how my day was, but I could see the shift in her eyes. That was when I started to put the pieces together. Jessica wasn't just discontent with our life. She was looking for something else. And from the way she was acting, I had a strong feeling she had already found it. The cracks in our marriage, the ones I had been trying so hard to ignore, were finally starting to show. And I knew it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. It wasn't long before I met him, Daniel, the new football coach. I had been hearing about him from Liam for weeks. Liam was more excited about football than he had ever been before. "Coach Daniel is awesome, Dad. He's teaching me so many new tricks," Liam would say, his face lighting up. I was glad he had a mentor to look up to, but there was something about the way Jessica talked about Daniel that made me uneasy. She didn't bring him up often, but when she did, her tone would change. There was a casualness to it that felt a bit too deliberate, like she was trying hard to make it seem like Daniel was just another person in her day-to-day life. But I noticed her eyes light up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "He's really great with the kids," she'd say, her voice almost too casual. "He used to play professionally, you know. Now he's coaching part-time while running a few businesses. Drives a Range Rover, too. Can you believe that?" I remember the first time I actually met Daniel. It was a Saturday morning, and I had made it to Liam's practice just in time. Jessica was already there, sitting on the sidelines with a group of moms, laughing at something Daniel had said. He stood tall, dressed in a fitted athletic jacket, his presence commanding attention without him even trying. I felt a pang of something I hadn't felt in years: jealousy. As I approached, Daniel glanced my way and gave me a nod, like he knew me but didn't care to. "Hey there, Marcus," he said, his tone polite but distant. "Liam's really coming along. He's got great potential." "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound cordial. "He loves playing for you." It was a short exchange, but enough for me to pick up on his vibe. Confident, charismatic. He was the kind of guy who knew how to work a crowd, how to charm people without even trying. But something about him rubbed me the wrong way. Even then, maybe it was the way Jessica laughed at his jokes, or how the other moms seemed to hang on his every word. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that this guy wasn't just interested in coaching kids. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. Jessica's time at Liam's practices turned into something more. She started staying after practice, claiming that she was chatting with the other moms or helping Daniel organize events for the team. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the weeks went by, it became clear that she wasn't just spending time at the field for Liam's sake. One evening, she came home later than usual. I was sitting in the living room, watching a game, when she walked in, looking more put together than I'd seen in a while: freshly styled hair, new clothes, and a glow that wasn't from spending hours at the football field. I turned down the volume on the TV and looked at her. "How was practice?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Great," she replied, flashing me a smile. "Liam's really improving. Daniel thinks he could be one of the top players on the team." I nodded, waiting for her to offer more. She didn't. Instead, she casually walked into the kitchen, leaving her phone on the counter. That's when I noticed a text notification from a name I hadn't seen before: Daniel. I stood up, heart racing, and glanced at the screen. It was a short message, but the meaning was crystal clear. "Had a great time today. Can't wait for next time." From that moment, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The texts, the late nights, the sudden interest in dressing up. It all started to make sense, and my suspicions grew stronger by the day. I began showing up at more practices, watching from the sidelines as Jessica interacted with Daniel. It wasn't overt, but there was a subtle connection between them. The kind of connection that didn't need words. A glance here, a touch there, both of them careful not to cross any obvious lines, but I could see it. I knew what I was looking at. One day, I overheard Jessica talking to one of the other moms after practice. "Oh, Daniel is so great with the kids, she said, her voice light and playful. He's got this whole other life outside of coaching his businesses, his travels. He's just so interesting. Lucky you. The other mom replied with a wink. You're around him all the time. I wouldn't mind spending a bit more time with Coach Daniel. Jessica laughed it off, but I could see the way her eyes lit up at the mention of his name. She liked the attention. She liked being around him, and it was clear she was getting something from him that I couldn't provide. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jessica lay beside me, her breathing steady and calm, as if nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that my wife was slipping away from me, right under my nose. I started paying more attention to her phone. She was careful, but not careful enough. The messages from Daniel kept coming, each one more personal than the last. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Lunch was fun. Let's do it again soon. They weren't just talking about football. It wasn't long before I realized that they were meeting outside of practice. Little lunches that turned into dinners. Time spent together that she never bothered to mention to me. And then there was the sleek, expensive Range Rover that Daniel drove. Jessica had always had a thing for men with status, men who could provide her with the lifestyle she craved. And here he was, offering her everything I couldn't, everything she thought she deserved. I felt sick. It was one thing to suspect, but it was another to know. And now, I knew. Jessica had found her way out of the life we had built together. And she was using our son's football practice as a cover for her affair with Daniel, a man who had once been my classmate but clearly held no respect for me. I wasn't just losing my wife. I was losing everything. And the worst part? I wasn't sure how to stop it. The signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Jessica's excuses, her secretive behavior, the sudden interest in getting dolled up before every practice, it all pointed in one direction. But even with all the red flags, I hadn't fully allowed myself to believe it. Not until one fateful night. It was a Wednesday, and Jessica was supposed to be out late, working with a client. She had mentioned something about a pedicure appointment across town, assuring me it was a last-minute gig. I didn't question her at first, but something about the way she rushed out of the house without giving me the usual details felt off. I decided to track her location using the app one had secretly installed on her phone weeks ago. My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitant. Part of me didn't want to know, but deep down, I knew that I needed to confirm what I already suspected. My heart pounded as the app pinpointed her location. She wasn't in the part of town she'd mentioned. In fact, she was nowhere near a residential area. Instead, she was miles outside the city at a place I recognized, a fancy Italian restaurant we used to go to, one that was well out of our current budget. I felt my chest tighten. There was no pedicure appointment. She wasn't with a client. She was with him, Daniel. I tried to keep myself calm, telling myself that maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe she was there for a different reason, but I knew better. I had seen the signs, felt the distance growing between us, and now the final piece was falling into place. I couldn't just sit at home, stewing in my anger. I grabbed my jacket, keys in hand, and made my way to the restaurant. As I drove, every mile felt like an eternity. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. How long had this been going on? How had I missed it for so long? What kind of fool had I been? When I arrived, I parked a block away, careful not to draw attention. The restaurant's warm glow spilled out onto the street, filled with laughter and chatter. It was the kind of place Jessica loved, high-end, classy, a place where someone like Daniel could easily impress her. I stood outside for a moment, gathering my thoughts, my stomach churning with anticipation. Through the large windows, I spotted them. There she was, my wife, sitting across from Daniel, laughing at something he said. They looked completely at ease, like they were the only two people in the world. She was leaning in slightly, her body language relaxed and familiar. Daniel, on the other hand, sat with the confidence of a man who knew he was winning. I felt my hands ball into fists as I watched them sip wine, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. The restaurant was busy, with couples and groups seated at every table, but in that moment, all I could see was them. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. It was written all over their faces. Part of me wanted to burst through the doors, confront them right then and there, demand an explanation. But something held me back. Maybe it was the crowd, or maybe it was the realization that I wasn't ready. I needed more. I needed undeniable proof, something that Jessica couldn't talk her way out of or spin into a misunderstanding. So, I left. I drove back home in silence, my mind a storm of emotions: anger, betrayal, disbelief. But beneath all of that, there was a small part of me that felt relief. Relief that I finally knew the truth, that my suspicions were no longer just shadows in the back of my mind. Now I had the clarity I needed to take action. When Jessica came home later that night, she was in good spirits. I watched her as she breezed through the door, humming softly to herself. She dropped her purse on the counter and headed to the bedroom to change. There was no guilt in her eyes, no hesitation. She didn't even glance in my direction as she walked past me, her phone still buzzing with notifications from clients. I waited until she was out of sight before I grabbed her phone from the counter. The passcode was still the same: our son's birthday. I unlocked it easily and scrolled through her messages. There they were, dozens of texts between her and Daniel. Some were about football, harmless on the surface, but others were more personal, intimate. Mentions of lunch dates, private meetups, and compliments that went far beyond friendly. My chest tightened with each message I read, the words burning into my mind like a brand. One message stood out more than the others, sent earlier that day: can't wait for tonight. I booked the table at our usual spot. See you at 7. Our usual spot. That's what they had become, regulars at some fancy restaurant, living a life I had no idea about. I put the phone down, my hands trembling. There was no denying it now. Jessica wasn't just having an emotional affair, she was living a double life, one that revolved around Daniel. All the pieces started to fit together. The new clothes, the sudden interest in makeup and pedicures, the late nights. She had built an entire world around him, and I had been blind to it. That night, I didn't sleep. Jessica, completely oblivious, lay beside me, her breath steady and calm as she drifted off without a care in the world. Meanwhile, my mind raced, replaying every moment, every sign I had missed. I couldn't believe how easily she had deceived me, how well she had hidden her tracks. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I had trusted her, believed in our marriage, in the life we were building together. And all the while, she had been sneaking around with Daniel, pretending like everything was fine. I needed a plan. I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't just sit back and watch her destroy everything we had built together. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not without more evidence, more leverage. Over the next few days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I smiled when I needed to, went to work as usual, and pretended everything was fine. But inside, I was planning, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jessica continued her charade, going about her day-to-day life as if nothing had changed. She still went to Liam's practices, still made excuses for her late-night appointments. But now, I saw through it all. I knew exactly where she was going, who she was meeting. And when the time was right, I would confront her. But not before I made sure she felt the same betrayal she had inflicted on me. The week that followed was a blur of conflicting emotions. On the surface, I was holding everything together, still running the business, still pretending things were normal, but inside, I was unraveling. Jessica's betrayal had cut deeper than I could have ever imagined, and the weight of what I knew was suffocating. I continued to play the part of the unsuspecting husband, even as I watched Jessica disappear into her lies, night after night. She didn't know that I had been following her movements, tracking every step she took, every moment she spent with Daniel. The truth was painful, but necessary. I needed every piece of evidence to confront her, and more importantly, to know how far this had gone. That Saturday, I decided it was time to take the next step. While Jessica was at her pedicure appointment, I drove to Liam's football practice. I needed to see if my suspicions about Daniel were true, to observe him when Jessica wasn't around. Liam was on the field, kicking the ball back and forth with a few other kids, but Daniel was nowhere to be seen. I walked up to one of the assistant coaches and asked casually, "Where's Coach Daniel today?" "He's out sick," the coach replied. "Said he wasn't feeling well, so he's skipping practice." Sick? My stomach twisted. Jessica had just texted me, saying she was heading out to work, but now I knew exactly where she was going. Not to some client's house, but to meet Daniel. My mind raced. I had to find them. I needed to catch them in the act. I drove around for nearly an hour, unsure of where to start. They had been good about hiding their tracks, meeting in places that were far enough away to avoid suspicion. But then, as I was about to give up and go home, I spotted a familiar car parked in front of an upscale hotel on the outskirts of town. Daniel's sleek black Range Rover gleamed under the hotel's neon lights, a stark contrast to the modest cars in the parking lot. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I pulled over, parking a few spots away. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that I needed to confirm what I already suspected. I needed to see it with my own eyes. As I stepped out of the car, my heart raced. The hotel lobby was quiet, a few guests milling about, but I didn't see Jessica or Daniel. I made my way toward the elevator, unsure of what I was even going to do if I found them. Confront them here? Drag them out in front of everyone? Before I could think too much about it, the elevator doors opened. And there they were, Jessica and Daniel. They didn't see me at first, too engrossed in their conversation. She was laughing, the sound grating against my nerves, while Daniel stood next to her, his hand resting on the small of her back in a way that was far too intimate for someone who was just a friend. I froze, my body going cold as everything I had feared was confirmed in that single moment. There was no escaping it now. My wife, the woman I had trusted, the mother of my child, was having an affair right in front of me. They walked past me, heading for the exit, still oblivious to my presence. I followed them outside, keeping my distance, watching as they made their way to Daniel's car. My blood boiled as I saw him open the passenger door for her, like she was some kind of prize. I didn't know what came over me, but before I could stop myself, I shouted, "Jessica!" They both turned, startled, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Jessica's eyes widened in horror as she saw me, her face going pale. "Marcus, I can explain," she stammered, stepping away from Daniel. But there was no explanation that could fix this. No lie that could undo the damage that had already been done. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. "You've been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back. And for what?" "Him?" Daniel stood there, silent, his expression unreadable. He didn't even try to defend himself, didn't even look at me. It was as if he had expected this moment, like he knew it was only a matter of time before I found out. Jessica, on the other hand, was panicking. "Marcus, it's not what it looks like. We were just what?" I snapped. "Just meeting at a hotel in the middle of nowhere? Just having lunch in secret? How long, Jessica? How long has this been going on?" She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. The guilt was written all over her face, and in that moment, I knew I didn't need to hear the details. The betrayal was enough. I turned to Daniel, my fists clenched. "You knew we were married. You knew, and you still did this." He finally spoke, his voice calm and infuriatingly casual. "Look, man, I didn't plan this. It just happened. Things got out of control." "Out of control?" I repeated, my voice low. "You destroyed my family." For a moment, I considered taking a swing at him, but I stopped myself. He wasn't worth it. None of this was worth it. I looked at Jessica one last time, her eyes pleading with me for forgiveness, for some kind of understanding, but I had none left to give. "This is over," I said, my voice cold and final. "Don't come back home tonight." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, the weight of their betrayal hanging in the air. The days after the confrontation felt like I was living in a fog. I hadn't spoken to Jessica since that night outside the hotel. She stayed away, probably too ashamed to come home. Or maybe she was just enjoying her time with Daniel. Either way, I didn't care anymore. The anger that had been burning inside me had shifted into something darker, something more calculating. Betrayal cuts deep, and the wound Jessica had left wasn't going to heal with time. I didn't just want to move on. I wanted her to feel the same pain, the same humiliation she had put me through. And I knew exactly how to do it. I thought back to Daniel's wife, Claire. We had never been close, but I remembered her from the few times we had crossed paths at football practice. She was beautiful, classy, and far too good for a man like Daniel. I wondered if she knew what her husband was up to, or if she was just as clueless as I had been. Either way, I had a feeling she wouldn't take kindly to learning about Daniel's affair with my wife. I decided to reach out to her. It took me a few days to muster up the courage to make the call. Part of me felt guilty for dragging someone else into this mess, but another part of me, an angrier part, wanted justice. I wanted her to know what her husband had done, and maybe, just maybe, we could find some kind of solace in each other's misery. When she picked up the phone, her voice was polite, almost distant. "Hello? Claire? It's Marcus, Liam's dad." There was a pause on the other end. "Oh, hi, Marcus. Is everything okay? Did something happen at practice?" I took a deep breath. It's not about practice. It's about Daniel. The silence on the other end told me she already knew, or at least suspected. "What about him?" she asked, her voice steady but strained. "He's been seeing Jessica for a while now," I said, my words blunt and to the point. There was no need for sugarcoating. Another long pause. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but laced with pain. "I thought so," she whispered. "I've had a feeling, but I didn't want to believe it." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of what I had just dropped on her. "I know this isn't easy." "No, it's not," she agreed, her voice steadying. "But thank you for telling me. I'd rather know the truth." What started as a simple phone call soon turned into something more. Over the next few days, Claire and I talked a lot more than I had expected. It wasn't just about the betrayal. We found ourselves venting about the same frustrations, the same pain, the same questions. How could they do this to us? What were we supposed to do now? I could tell that Claire was still in shock, still processing everything. But there was something about her, this quiet strength that drew me in. Unlike Jessica, who had spiraled into selfishness, Claire remained composed, though I could hear the hurt in her voice. It was that shared pain that bonded us. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of thinking too much about Jessica and Daniel, I found myself texting Claire. It started innocently enough, a check-in, making sure she was okay. But the conversation quickly took a turn. "Do you want to meet up?" I asked, my heart racing as I typed the words. A few seconds passed before her reply came through. "I'd like that." We met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far away from the places where we might run into familiar faces. When I walked in, I saw Claire sitting at a corner table, her eyes downcast, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked up as I approached, offering me a weak smile. "Thanks for meeting me," I said as I sat down, unsure of how to start. "Thanks for asking," she replied, her eyes soft but clouded with emotion. For the first hour, we talked about everything but Daniel and Jessica. It felt good to escape the heaviness of our situations, if only for a while. We laughed about trivial things, old memories, funny moments with our kids, but beneath the surface, we both knew why we were there. By the time the conversation shifted back to our spouses, the mood had changed. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken but undeniable. Claire leaned in slightly, her gaze steady on mine. "I keep asking myself how I missed it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "How I could have been so blind." I shook my head. "It's not your fault. They were good at hiding it. At least, until they weren't." She sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "I feel like such a fool." "You're not," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "They're the ones who should feel like fools." Our eyes met, and for a moment, I felt something shift between us. A connection, a shared understanding. Maybe it was the anger, maybe it was the hurt, but suddenly, I didn't feel so alone. And I could tell Claire felt the same. Before I knew what was happening, the distance between us disappeared. Claire reached out, her hand resting gently on mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. I squeezed her hand in return, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. What happened next wasn't planned, but it felt inevitable. The conversation stopped, the words no longer necessary. There was nothing left to say. Without thinking, I leaned in, and so did she. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, fueled by the anger and pain we had both been carrying for too long. In that moment, revenge didn't feel so far-fetched. It felt right. When we finally pulled away, breathless and flushed, Claire gave me a sad smile. "I didn't expect that," she whispered. "Neither did I," I admitted, my heart racing. But I didn't regret it. Not for a second. That night marked the beginning of something unexpected. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about finding solace in each other's brokenness. Claire and I continued to see each other, slowly but surely healing from the wounds our spouses had inflicted. And as for Jessica, she had no idea. Not yet, at least. But when the time came, I knew exactly how to make her feel the sting of betrayal, just like she had done to me. The day of the confrontation loomed over me like a storm waiting to break. For weeks, I had been living in a strange dual reality. On one side was the everyday life I shared with Liam, taking him to school, helping with homework, and trying to keep things as normal as possible. On the other side, there was the secret I shared with Claire. It had become my escape, my outlet for the anger and betrayal that simmered beneath the surface. But no matter how much time I spent with her, the reality of my broken marriage lingered in the background. I knew the confrontation with Jessica was inevitable. She had come home sporadically since the night I caught her with Daniel. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, and her attempts to act normal were laughably transparent. She didn't even bother explaining where she had been anymore, knowing I wouldn't believe her. I had stopped asking. I wasn't interested in her excuses or lies. I was biding my time, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a Saturday afternoon, one of those quiet, deceptively peaceful days where nothing seemed amiss. Liam was at a friend's house, giving me the perfect opportunity to finally confront Jessica. I knew she was home. Her car was in the driveway, and I could hear her in the kitchen, humming to herself like she didn't have a care in the world. I took a deep breath and walked in. Jessica didn't look up when I entered the kitchen. She was busy making lunch, chopping vegetables with a little too much focus. I leaned against the counter, watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge my presence. When she finally did, she offered me a weak smile, as if she could still pretend that nothing had changed between us. "Hey," she said, her voice light, too casual. "Want some lunch?" I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, and for a brief second, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. She put the knife down, wiping her hands on a towel before turning to face me fully. "Okay," she said slowly. "What's on your mind?" I didn't waste time beating around the bush. "I know about you and Daniel." Jessica's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks, and her eyes widened in shock. But instead of denying it, like I had half expected, she just stood there, frozen, as if she hadn't prepared for this moment. "Marcus," she started, but I cut her off. "Don't. I don't want to hear your excuses, Jessica. I've seen the texts. I've seen you together. You can stop pretending." She looked down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "It just did. It just did, huh?" I repeated bitterly. "You didn't mean to sneak around behind my back for months? You didn't mean to lie to me, to destroy everything we've built?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might try to apologize. But then something shifted in her expression, something colder, more defiant. "I'm not happy, Marcus," she said, her voice steadying. "I haven't been for a long time. You're always working, always stressed about money. I need more than this. More than what you can give me." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. I had expected excuses, but not this. Not a full-blown attack on my ability to provide. I felt my hands ball into fists, the anger rising again, but I forced myself to stay calm. "So that's it? You just threw away our marriage because I wasn't making enough money? You couldn't wait until the business stabilized, until we got through this rough patch? You had to run off to Daniel because he has a nicer car and a bigger bank account? It's not just about money," she snapped, her voice rising. "It's about everything. You and I, we're not the same people we used to be. We're growing apart. And Daniel, he understands me. He makes me feel alive again." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. "Alive? You're a grown woman, Jessica. You don't get to just chase after whatever makes you feel alive like some teenager. For a moment, the room was silent. Jessica stood there, her shoulders slumped, as if the fight had gone out of her. But then she met my eyes, and I saw something else in her expression: guilt, regret. I didn't want to hurt you, she said softly. I didn't plan for this to happen, Marcus. But it did. And now I don't know how to fix it. I shook my head, feeling the last bit of sympathy drain away. There's no fixing this, I said, my voice cold. What's done is done. But I hope you know something, Jessica. She looked up, her eyes filled with tears again. What? I'm not the fool you think I am. I know about more than just you and Daniel. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. You think you're the only one who found someone else? Her eyes widened in shock, confusion flickering across her face. What are you talking about? Claire, I said, watching her reaction carefully. Daniel's wife. She knows too. And unlike you, I didn't sneak around. I told her the truth. Jessica's face twisted in disbelief. You're lying. No, I'm not. I stepped even closer, my voice low but firm. You wanted more? Well, I found more too. And you know what, Jessica? Claire and we've been spending a lot of time together. Her mouth dropped open, the shock in her eyes quickly turning to anger. You slept with her? I didn't answer directly. Instead, I let the silence fill the space between us. Jessica's breathing quickened, her hands trembling as she tried to process what I had just told her. You're disgusting, she spat, her voice shaking. You're no better than me. Maybe I'm not, I admitted. But I'm not the one who destroyed our family first. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling with each breath, as the weight of our broken marriage settled between us. There was nothing left to say. We were done, and we both knew it. I turned and walked toward the door, leaving her standing there in the kitchen, her world unraveling the way mine had weeks ago. As I reached the door, I stopped and looked back at her one last time. Don't come back tonight, I said quietly, and don't try to fix this. It's over. And with that, I walked out, leaving Jessica to face the consequences of her betrayal, just as I had faced mine. There was no victory in revenge, no satisfaction in seeing her hurt, but there was closure, and that was all I needed. After walking out of that kitchen, I didn't look back. The moment I stepped through that door, I felt a strange sense of relief, almost as if a heavy weight had been lifted off my chest. The anger and betrayal that had consumed me for weeks were still there, but now they were fading into the background. What I had left was clarity and a new sense of direction. It was time to move on. That night, I stayed at a hotel, giving Jessica the space to figure things out. I didn't want to fight anymore. I didn't want to argue or hear her try to justify what she'd done. The confrontation had been draining, and the thought of going through it again was unbearable. As I lay in that unfamiliar room, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted peace. For too long, I had been reacting to Jessica's betrayal, living in response to her choices, her actions. Now, I needed to make decisions for myself, for my future, and most importantly, for Liam. The next morning, I went back to the house to pick up a few things. Jessica wasn't there. She must have left early, maybe to avoid another confrontation. I was grateful for the silence as I packed a bag, grabbing enough clothes and essentials to get by for the next few days. The house felt different now, emptier, colder. The warmth we had once shared was gone, replaced by the echoes of what used to be. Liam came home later that afternoon, full of stories from his weekend with his friend. I sat him down and told him that his mother and I needed some time apart. I didn't go into details, he was only 8, and I didn't want to burden him with adult problems. I reassured him that we both loved him very much and that nothing would change for him. He took it better than I expected, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. Is it because of football? He asked quietly, his voice small. No, buddy. It's not because of football, I said, pulling him into a hug. Sometimes grown-ups just need some space to figure things out. But I promise we're both here for you. That seemed to satisfy him, and he quickly changed the subject, asking if we could watch his favorite movie together. I smiled, grateful for the distraction. For Liam's sake, I needed to be strong, even when it hurt. As the days turned into weeks, the reality of my new life began to sink in. I officially moved out of the house, renting a small apartment nearby so I could stay close to Liam. The arrangement worked well enough. I had Liam during the week, and Jessica took him on weekends. It was awkward at first seeing her at the handoffs, knowing that we were still tied together by our son despite everything that had happened. But over time, we settled into a rhythm, a strained kind of normalcy. Jessica tried to reach out a few times, suggesting that we talk, but I wasn't ready. I didn't want to rehash the past. What was there to say? She had made her choice, and I had made mine. The distance between us grew wider, and I was okay with that. I didn't need to understand her anymore. I just needed to focus on myself and my son. I stopped seeing Claire. What had started as revenge had run its course, and though there had been moments where I thought something real might develop between us, we both knew it wasn't meant to last. Our connection was born out of pain, and once that pain began to heal, the bond we shared began to fade. We parted on good terms, understanding that we needed to move on with our lives in different directions. My business, surprisingly, began to flourish. Without the constant strain of Jessica's demands and the emotional turmoil of our failing marriage, I found myself able to focus more clearly on my work. The deals I had been struggling to close started to fall into place, and my client base grew steadily. It wasn't an overnight success, but it was enough to stabilize things, enough to give me hope for the future. I started taking better care of myself, too. I went back to the gym, began eating healthier, and even picked up a hobby: woodworking. It was something I had always wanted to try but never found the time for. Now, with the quiet hours of my evenings free, I found solace in shaping something with my own hands, turning raw materials into something meaningful. But the most important part of my healing came from my time with Liam. We spent more time together than ever before, playing football in the yard, going on hikes, building Lego sets late into the night. He was my anchor, the reason I pushed through the darkest moments. Every laugh, every smile reminded me that I still had something to fight for, something to build my life around. Months passed, and the pain of Jessica's betrayal began to dull. It would never fully go away, but it no longer controlled me. I had stopped checking her social media, stopped wondering what she and Daniel were doing, and stopped caring about what might have been. I was done with the what-ifs and focused instead on the what next. One evening, as Liam and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set, he looked up at me with those big, curious eyes. "Are you happy, Dad?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about happiness in a long time. I had been so consumed with surviving, with getting through each day, that I hadn't stopped to consider where I stood. But as I looked out at the setting sun, with my son by my side and a new sense of peace in my heart, I realized something. "I think I am, buddy," I said, smiling down at him. "I think I'm getting there." Liam grinned, leaning his head on my shoulder. "Me too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Life hadn't turned out the way I had expected, and there were still challenges ahead. But I had made it through the worst of it, and now I had a chance to rebuild. Moving on wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had learned that healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in small moments, in quiet victories. And as I sat there with Liam, I realized that this quiet, simple life was enough for me. The past was behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace the future.